Number 1. Luke Trussell. On the morning of June 5, 2024, the quiet rural north of Marion, Iowa, was jolted awake by the sound of police sirens cutting through a landscape usually defined by wind and open fields. When the first officers pushed open the door of an old barn, isolated from nearby homes, they immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The air inside was thick and heavy, the silence almost suffocating. Then they saw them 4 bodies lying motionless on the cold concrete floor. The injuries were so horrific that even officers accustomed to facing death had to pause for a few seconds to steady themselves. In those first moments, no one could fully comprehend what had happened here. An accident, toxic fumes, or some kind of disaster beyond ordinary imagination. Outside the barn, by the side of the road, sat a man with his head bowed. He wasn't running. He wasn't crying. He wasn't trying to explain himself. His eyes were empty, as if his mind had already left his body. That man was 35-year-old Luke Trussell. As police struggled to piece together the fragments of the scene, the man slowly looked up and delivered a brief confession. In that instant, everything changed. 4 lives were gone, and the killer was sitting right in front of them, chillingly calm. Before that horrific morning, Luke Trussell was not a name that raised alarm for anyone. He lived in Marion like many other working-class men, waking up early, doing contract work for a roofing company, coming home after dark. His life followed a quiet, repetitive rhythm. Luke had a family. He had children. He carried the weight of providing for them. To neighbors and coworkers, he was simply a reserved, soft-spoken man who kept to himself and caused no trouble. His legal record was nearly empty, just a property damage incident from years ago and a minor assault charge in his youth. No serious criminal history. No clear signs of an uncontrollably violent person. No one looked at Luke and thought he could become the perpetrator of a massacre. But sometimes, collapse doesn't arrive with noise or warning. It begins in silence, in sleepless nights, in mounting pressure, in the same wrong choices made over and over again. And the most haunting question isn't what Luke did, but what quietly destroyed a man who once seemed so ordinary. No one can point to the exact moment when Luke Trussell began to lose himself. The collapse didn't happen in a single day. It unfolded quietly, stretched across countless sleepless nights. Methamphetamine entered Luke's life as a false escape. At first, it was just a way to stay awake for work, to push past exhaustion, to outrun the pressure of making a living. But over time, the drug crept into every corner of his mind. For 2 straight days, Luke didn't sleep. His body was drained, yet his brain was forced to keep running. Fragmented thoughts began to connect in distorted ways. Reality and illusion blurred. Luke started hearing things no one had said, believing things that didn't exist. In that state, he no longer saw the world through the reason of a normal mind, but through fear and paranoia fueled by drugs. Luke became convinced he was surrounded by evil, that dangerous people were closing in. And worst of all, he believed he was the only one who could see the truth. When a person is deprived of sleep long enough and eroded by drugs deeply enough, the line between right and wrong disappears. That was the moment Luke's mind finally collapsed piece by piece. In silence. That morning, the property along Otter Road looked no different from any other morning in rural Iowa. Quiet, isolated. No noise, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. An old barn stood silently on the open land, a place people came to rest, to fix things, to step away from the pace of city life. Inside that property were 4 people, 2 couples, who had traveled from Cedar Rapids. 34-year-old Brent Brown and 26-year-old Kiana Ryan carried with them youth and unfinished plans. 33-year-old Amanda Parker and 44-year-old Ramandis Cooper were more seasoned by life, having weathered enough ups and downs to truly value rare moments of peace. They were not criminals. They had no conflicts with anyone. They had no idea they were standing so close to tragedy. To them, it was just an ordinary day, a morning that gave no warning of what was coming. None of the 4 could have imagined that a place once associated with safety was about to become the scene of an irreversible catastrophe. What happened next was captured by security cameras around the property cold, detached, and without emotion. Luke Trussell walked into the barn, where Ramandis Cooper and Kiana Ryan were inside. There was no loud argument, no desperate screams echoing outside. Just minutes later, Luke emerged again, his movements slow and unsteady, as if he were drifting between two worlds. At that moment, Brent Brown and Amanda Parker entered the barn, perhaps because they sensed something was wrong, perhaps because they believed someone inside needed help. They didn't know they had just crossed the final boundary of life. Inside that enclosed space, Luke was holding a long metal pipe, heavy, cold, and unforgiving. Blow after blow followed, delivered in a state of uncontrolled delusion. There was none of the familiar rage of a typical fight, only relentless, mechanical brutality, repeated until all movement stopped. The level of violence was so extreme that prosecutors would later compare the victims' injuries to those seen in high-speed car crashes. When the barn door finally closed, 4 lives had been taken in silence, leaving behind a crime scene so horrifying that anyone who saw it struggled to believe it was real. After everything was over, Luke Trussell didn't run. He didn't try to erase evidence or look for a way out. Instead, he sat outside the barn, on the edge of the road, head lowered, motionless like someone who had just awakened from a nightmare he couldn't even begin to understand. When his father, Larry Trussell, sensed that something was wrong, he panicked and rushed to the scene. In the recorded footage, the father can be heard screaming for an ambulance, shouting directly at his son, demanding to know what had happened. But Luke didn't respond. His eyes were empty, his words scattered, as if his mind had already left his body. At first, police still considered Luke a witness. That changed the moment he crossed the final line himself. Luke said that he was the one who attacked them. He pointed out where the weapon had been hidden. No denial, no excuses. During later questioning, Luke spoke about his delusions about believing the victims were evil. He said he felt regret, that he feared his children would one day hate him. Then came the sentence that silenced the room. When asked why he did it, Luke replied that the truth was he wanted to make a movie. There was no camera. There was no audience. Only 4 lives that would never get the chance to go on. The trial took place in November 2024, under a heavy atmosphere that hung over the courtroom. On the defense side, attorneys attempted to raise doubt. They argued that Luke Trussell was not mentally stable when he confessed. They hinted at a flawed investigation, even questioning the role of his father. But against those claims, the evidence spoke quietly and decisively. Security camera footage, DNA traces on the murder weapon, the victim's blood on Luke's clothing, and his own confessions, impossible to take back. After days of arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. 2 days passed in tense silence and anticipation. When they returned, the verdict was read slowly. Guilty. 3 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count of second-degree murder. Inside the courtroom, silent tears fell. Family members of the victims held one another, some whispering words of thanks not because the pain had faded, but because, at last, the truth had been spoken by its rightful name. Luke Trussell was sentenced to life in prison. No parole. No way back. The rest of his life will pass behind cold steel bars, where each day mirrors the one before it, and every night forces him to confront what he has done. But that sentence cannot close the wounds of the families who lost their loved ones on that fateful morning. 4 lives were taken along with dreams, never realized, leaving behind voids that can never be filled. The case of Luke Trussell is not just the story of a killer. It is a stark warning about drugs, about how substances like methamphetamine can quietly erode the mind, blur the line between right and wrong, and turn an ordinary person into an instrument of destruction. In that once peaceful place, the barn still stands, silent in the middle of the fields. But what happened inside will remain a scar that never heals, a reminder that a single wrong choice can destroy an entire life and drag innocent ones down with it. Number 2. Jerry Lynn Burns. In December 1979, winter settled over Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in a cold, gray hush. On the night of December 19, Westdale Mall slowly shut down store by store, lights going dark after a long day. Out in the vast parking lot, an old Buick Electra sat quietly, unnoticed by anyone passing by. It wasn't until the early hours of the next morning that a security guard sensed something was wrong. Inside the car, a young woman was slumped forward in the front seat. The blood had already dried. Death had been there for hours. Michelle Martino, just 18 years old, was never going home again. And from that moment on, a haunting question took hold, one that would linger for nearly 4 decades. Who did this and why? Michelle Martino was the picture of an 18-year-old full of life. She was a senior at Kennedy High School, bright, active, involved in choir and theater, and working part-time at the mall to help support her family. Michelle had clear dreams. She wanted to go to college. She wanted to study interior design. She wanted to leave Iowa and see a bigger world beyond it. Family and friends remember her as kind, gentle, someone with no enemies and no ties to trouble. That evening, Michelle attended a party with her school choir. She wore a black dress and a white fur coat, laughing and talking like any other teenage girl. After the party, she stopped by the mall to pick up a coat her mother had ordered. A simple errand, a harmless trip. No one could have known it would be her final journey. When police opened the door of the Buick, they immediately knew this was not a robbery. Michelle had been attacked repeatedly, with dozens of wounds concentrated on her upper body. The injuries were severe and overwhelming, leaving no chance of survival. What investigators could tell, however, was that Michelle had not given up easily. She fought desperately to stay alive. During that struggle, the attacker was also injured, leaving traces behind on her clothing and inside the vehicle. But in 1979, those traces were nothing more than silent evidence. At the time, science had no way to give them a voice. They could not reveal who the attacker was. They could only remain there, preserved in silence, waiting for a future where technology might finally tell their story. Police investigated every possible lead. A former boyfriend, friends, anyone who had seen Michelle that night. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing was taken, and no clear motive emerged. The case file grew thicker and then, eventually, it was closed. Years passed. Michelle Martino's name became one more entry on the list of cold cases. Her parents aged under the weight of unanswered grief. They passed away without ever knowing who had taken their daughter from them. The case seemed buried by time. But in truth, it wasn't gone. It was only sleeping, waiting for the day it would finally be awakened. Many years later, a detective revisited the old file and noticed something that had never been fully pursued. The biological trace left on the car's gear shift. By then, DNA technology had changed the world. A genetic profile was reconstructed. It didn't match anyone in the criminal database. But then, a new path emerged, one that hadn't existed decades earlier. Genetic genealogy. The profile was uploaded to a public database, where ordinary people voluntarily share their DNA to find relatives. A connection appeared. Distant but real. Enough to follow. Investigators began building a family tree, branch by branch, carefully ruling people out. And eventually, only one name remained: Jerry Lynn Burns. In 2018, police began quietly monitoring Jerry Burns, who was now in his early 60s. On the surface, he appeared to be an ordinary man. A family. A job. No history of homicide. Nothing that seemed to connect him to a decades-old mystery. One day, Burns stopped at a restaurant. He ordered a drink, used a plastic straw. Then he left. Police recovered that straw. The test results left no room for doubt. The genetic profile was a match to the biological trace found on Michelle Martino's clothing. The probability of error was virtually zero. When questioned, Burns remained cold and emotionless. He showed no shock, no fear. He simply said, "Test the DNA." And after nearly 40 years of silence and denial, science answered for him. The trial began in 2020. The prosecution presented its case through science data, statistics, and probabilities built on decades of advancement. The defense pushed back, challenging the use of genetic genealogy and arguing that it crossed boundaries of personal privacy. But the jury listened carefully to the facts. After only a few hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. First-degree murder. Inside the courtroom, Michelle's family held one another and wept not out of celebration, but out of release. After so many years, the name of the person responsible for their daughter's death was finally spoken out loud. In 2020, Jerry Lynn Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Every appeal that followed was denied. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Michelle Martino, if she were still alive today, would be in her early 60s. She might have had a family, children, a full and ordinary life. But that time was taken from her on a winter night in 1979. This case is not just the story of a man exposed after 39 years. It is a reminder that truth can be buried for a long time, but if it is preserved, if patience endures, justice will eventually find its way back. Late, perhaps, but never lost. Number 3. Shanna Galliar. Dave Krupa's phone never stopped vibrating. Message after message, emails flooding his inbox. I'm watching you. I have a key to your apartment. I know exactly where you are. For months, then years, Dave's life was wrapped in an invisible fear. What made it truly disturbing wasn't just the threatening words themselves, but the name attached to them. Carrie Farver. The problem was that woman had vanished long ago. No one had seen her. No one had heard her voice. And yet, on phone screens and computer monitors, Carrie was still there, still speaking, still watching, still haunting every moment of the lives she left behind. Carrie Farver was a single mother living in Iowa, working in the field of information technology. Friends described her as energetic, outgoing, and deeply devoted to her young son, who always came first in her life. In 2012, Carrie met Dave Krupa, an auto mechanic who had recently come out of a marriage. Their relationship was brief, casual, with no long-term promises or commitments. But just a few weeks later, Carrie disappeared. She didn't return home. She didn't show up at work. She missed her son's birthday. She didn't even attend her own father's funeral. Instead, messages began to appear, claiming she had chosen to leave, that she didn't want to be found. But the people who loved Carrie knew something wasn't right. Whatever had happened, it didn't fit the woman they knew at all. Shanna Galliar, a woman who had briefly dated Dave Krupa before Carrie, also appeared to be a victim. She claimed that she was being harassed, threatened, and constantly watched by Carrie. She said her home had even been set on fire. Shanna cried, expressed fear, and turned to Dave for comfort. Two people believed they were facing the same unseen enemy. What no one realized was that the person sending thousands of messages, the one fueling the fear, the chaos, and the obsession was standing right in front of them the entire time, playing the role of a victim with chilling perfection. For more than 3 years, over 50,000 text messages and tens of thousands of emails were sent, every single one signed with the name Carrie Farver. The messages grew increasingly extreme, disturbingly detailed. They described what Dave was wearing, where he was, what he was doing. Some messages arrived while Dave was sitting right next to Galliar, clearly seeing that her hands never touched her phone. At first, police believed Carrie was still alive and intentionally hiding. But to Carrie's mother, something felt deeply wrong. Line after line, the words didn't sound like her daughter. There was no warmth, no familiar tone. What spoke through those messages felt artificial, cold, hollow, and entirely chawed to the woman she knew. In 2015, investigators decided to change their approach. A new question was finally asked: what if Carrie was no longer alive? Digital forensic experts were brought in. They traced network addresses, devices, memory cards, and hidden data. Layer by layer, the illusion began to fall apart. The messages were traced back to devices directly linked to Shanna Galliar. Her fingerprints were later found inside Carrie's vehicle. And then, on an old phone, investigators discovered an image subtle, unsettling, and unmistakable. It showed human remains in an advanced state of decay. Quiet, undeniable proof that Carrie Farver had not simply walked away. She had been taken from this world. The investigation revealed that Galliar had created an entire web of false identities. She pretended to be Carrie. She pretended to be friends. She even posed as anonymous individuals claiming responsibility, all to mislead investigators. She went as far as injuring herself and damaging her own home, everything necessary to keep the illusion alive, to convince everyone that Carrie was still out there, unpredictable and dangerous. This was no longer just a single crime. It was a prolonged psychological manipulation, stretched across years, one in which the person behind it fed on fear, confusion, and control, while hiding in plain sight. In 2017, Shanna Galliar was brought to trial. There was no body, no eyewitness who saw the final moment. What existed instead was a mountain of digital evidence, witness testimony, and a chain of logic that could not be broken. Prosecutors called it a case of a new era, one where truth was no longer found in physical traces, but in data. In messages, devices, timelines, and patterns that told a story words alone could not hide. The judge concluded that Carrie Farver had been killed and that the person responsible was Shanna Galliar. The verdict was delivered: guilty, first-degree murder, and arson. A case built not on what could be seen with the eyes, but on what technology revealed in silence. Shanna Galliar was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Carrie Farver has never been found. There is no grave for her son to visit. No place for her mother to leave flowers. This case leaves behind a chilling echo. It shows that in the digital age, a person can be destroyed not only through physical means, but through deception, impersonation, and years of relentless psychological torment. A life can be taken, then forced to continue as a shadow on screens, messages, and emails, long after the person is gone. And sometimes, the most terrifying part is not the loss itself, but the fact that the one responsible was able to live inside that lie for years, blending into ordinary life, unnoticed, while the truth waited silently to be uncovered. Number 4. Christian Bahana Rivera. The town of Brooklyn, Iowa, is home to just around 1,700 people, a place where neighbors greet each other by name, where roads are quiet, and where a sense of safety feels so natural it rarely needs to be questioned. On the evening of July 18, 2018, Molly Tibbetts stepped out of the house where she was dog-sitting for her boyfriend. She laced up her shoes, turned on her music, and headed out for a familiar jog. The summer sky was still bright. The air was calm, peaceful. No one could have imagined that within minutes, this small town would be pulled into a nightmare, one that would grip the community and the nation for weeks to come. Molly Tibbetts was 20 years old, a psychology student at the University of Iowa. She was bright, energetic, and deeply compassionate, someone who loved children and dreamed of one day earning a doctorate, writing books, and helping others heal. Family and friends described Molly as someone who was always connected. She always replied to messages, always checked in, always cared. She was known for keeping long Snapchat streaks with the people she loved, sometimes lasting hundreds of days, without missing a single one. For Molly, disappearing without a word was simply not who she was. But that evening, the messages stopped. The streak was broken, and the silence began. The next morning, Molly didn't show up for work. Her phone was turned off. Her tracking devices went silent. Her family contacted police immediately. Within hours, Brooklyn transformed into a massive search zone. Posters appeared everywhere. Shirts printed with Molly's face filled the streets. The FBI joined the investigation. The reward for information climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Molly's mother stood before cameras, her voice shaking, pleading with anyone who might be holding her daughter to please let her go. But as the days passed, hope slowly gave way to a fear no one wanted to name. Investigators reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and then one detail stood out, something impossible to ignore. Along the route where Molly had gone jogging, a black Chevrolet Malibu appeared again and again. It passed by, turned around, then appeared once more, as if it were watching. For more than 20 minutes, the same vehicle followed the same stretch of road. This wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. That was the moment the investigation began to narrow. And the moment a name slowly started to emerge from the shadows. Christian Bahana Rivera was 24 years old, working at a nearby farm. Quiet, reserved, someone most people barely noticed. When police approached him, Rivera appeared calm. But under sustained questioning, his story began to crack. Eventually, Rivera admitted that he had noticed Molly while she was out jogging. He said he found her attractive and began following her with his car. When Molly realized she was being watched, she took out her phone and threatened to call the police. According to Rivera, that was the moment he lost control. His confession led investigators to a cornfield outside town, where Molly Tibbetts was found, hidden only lightly by leaves and soil. That was where her run came to an end. What had started as an ordinary evening jog ended in a place no one should ever have to be found. The medical findings later confirmed that Molly suffered multiple fatal injuries. She had no chance to survive. She passed away alone, in the middle of a cornfield, a place meant only for wind, open land, and quiet. When the news became public, the entire country was shaken. But the pain of Molly's family was soon pulled into a different kind of storm. Politics, immigration, arguments that had nothing to do with the young woman who lost her life. Molly's family spoke out clearly. They did not want their daughter turned into a symbol or a talking point for anyone's agenda. To them, Molly was simply Molly, a young woman who went out for a run and never came home. At the 2021 trial, prosecutors presented a clear and tightly connected case. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, traces found inside the vehicle, and Rivera's own earlier admissions. But then, unexpectedly, Rivera changed his story. He claimed that two masked men had forced him to drive and were responsible for what happened. A narrative with no supporting evidence, no consistency, no logic. The jury did not take long to decide. The verdict was read. See first-degree murder. Rivera stood still, showing no visible emotion, as the sentence was announced while the weight of what had been taken settled permanently over the courtroom. Christian Behenner Rivera was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never walk free again. But for Molly Tibbetts' family, no sentence can bring their daughter back. A young woman who dreamed of writing books and building a future was taken away because of someone else's moment of loss of control. This case leaves behind a chilling reminder: even in places that feel safest, danger can still appear. And sometimes, a familiar evening routine, something as ordinary as a run, can permanently alter the lives of countless people. Molly went out to do what she had done so many times before. She trusted the world around her. And that trust was never returned. Number 5. Dustin Honkin. On a sweltering summer day in July 1993, in Mason City, Iowa, two young girls were playing in their front yard. They were wearing swimsuits, passing the time, waiting for an ordinary afternoon to unfold. A knock came at the door. No one inside the house knew that within just a few hours, 4 people would vanish and that the 2 innocent children would never come home again. When their remains were later discovered in a remote wooded area, the United States was forced to confront a crime so cold and calculated that it pushed the limits of what the human mind could comprehend. Dustin Honkin grew up in a broken household. His father struggled with alcoholism and had a history of serious crime. But Honkin was not unintelligent. In fact, he was highly capable, strong in mathematics, with a natural talent for chemistry. While taking chemistry classes at a community college, Honkin began to see another path to making money. A dangerous one. He became involved in the production of illegal substances. Not content with simply producing them, Honkin was obsessed with refinement, making his product purer, stronger, more profitable. Armed with chemistry textbooks and meticulous handwritten notes, he built an underground operation where efficiency and profit outweighed any remaining sense of morality. What began as academic curiosity slowly transformed into an enterprise driven by greed, control, and a complete disregard for human consequences. Honkin's drug operation brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars. But with that money came betrayal. When one associate was arrested and chose to cooperate with police, Honkin realized his freedom was at risk. For him, prison was not an option. And when fear outweighed conscience, he made a decision few could even imagine. He chose to eliminate anyone who might testify against him. Not only the person who had turned on him, but also those who happened to be closest, those who knew too much simply by being nearby. In Honkin's mind, Silence was the only form of safety left. Honkin and Angela Johnson went to the home where Greg Nicholson was staying with his girlfriend, Lori Duncan, and her 2 young daughters. Lori had nothing to do with drugs. She was simply a single mother trying to build a life for her family. But that offered no protection. All 4 were taken away from the house and driven to a remote wooded area. Greg and Lori were restrained and killed there, out of sight and far from help. The 2 girls, 10-year-old Candy and 6-year-old Amber, were forced to kneel. What happened next was swift and irreversible. There were no screams heard, no witnesses, only a level of cruelty so stark, so deliberate, that it left the country struggling to comprehend how anyone could carry it out, especially against children. Honkin didn't stop there. He went on to take the life of Terry DeJews, another associate who could have become a witness. Terry was assaulted, then silenced and buried in a shallow grave. 5 victims, 5 lives taken, among them 2 children. With no witnesses left, Honkin believed he had won. Federal charges were initially dropped. There was no one left to testify in court. For a time, he walked free, convinced he had escaped justice. But what Honkin didn't understand was this: truth doesn't disappear just because voices are silenced. It only waits. But crimes do not vanish simply because the person responsible believes they have. Years later, investigators finally traced their way back to Angela Johnson. While in prison, under mounting psychological pressure, she drew a hand-sketched map. A forest. A specific location. When police followed it and began digging, the truth emerged exactly where the map had indicated. Human remains were uncovered, one after another. Signs of restraint. Evidence of fatal harm. A silent story told without words. Dustin Honkin was arrested once again. This time, there was no escape. The case was tried at the federal level under unprecedented security. Dustin Honkin was convicted of murder committed in connection with organized criminal activity. The jury returned the harshest possible sentence, death. Angela Johnson was also sentenced to death, a penalty later reduced to life in prison. Inside the courtroom, the families of the victims sat in silence. There was no sense of victory, no relief. Only the emptiness left behind by losses that could never be repaired. Justice had spoken, but nothing it said could restore what had been taken. In 2020, Dustin Honkin was executed by lethal injection. He became the first person connected to a case in Iowa to receive the death penalty after many decades. 2 children were never given the chance to grow up. A mother was never given the chance to protect her daughters. A criminal empire collapsed, leaving behind trauma that will echo for generations. This case stands as a chilling reminder: when money and power are placed above human life, evil does not stop at a single loss. It spreads. It consumes everything in its path, including the most innocent lives of all. Number 6. Seth Tekel. In the early morning hours of May 26, 2012, the quiet rural community of Agency, Iowa, was shattered by an emergency call. A man's trembling voice came through the line. "My wife has been shot. She's not breathing." When first responders arrived, they found 23-year-old Lisa Tekel lying motionless on the bed. She was 17 weeks pregnant. The caller was her husband, Seth Tekel. He told police that an intruder had entered the home while he was in the shower. But from the very first moments, something about the scene felt wrong. An unease settled over the house, one that facts alone would soon begin to expose. Lisa Caldwell Tekel was a young woman full of determination and promise. She worked as a correctional officer, served as a reserve deputy, and was the daughter of a highly respected law enforcement officer. Lisa loved the outdoors, loved staying active, and was eagerly preparing to welcome her first child, a baby girl she planned to name Zoe. To her family and friends, Lisa represented a future just beginning to unfold: a young marriage, a small home, a simple, hopeful dream. No one could have imagined that her life would end at just 23 years old, inside the very place that was supposed to keep her safe. Seth Tekel presented himself to the public as a grieving husband. He was a volunteer firefighter, preparing to pursue a career in law enforcement. Seth told investigators a story about a suspicious neighbor, about land disputes, about someone nearby with mental health issues. On the surface, it all sounded reasonable. But as investigators began to look closer, small details started to drift out of alignment. The timeline didn't quite fit. There were no signs of forced entry, and certain weapons in the home were never mentioned at all. Bit by bit, the version of events Seth had described began to unravel quietly, but unmistakably. The turning point came from Seth's phone. Investigators uncovered hundreds of intimate messages between Seth and a coworker named Rachel. The conversations went far beyond casual emotion. They revealed dependency, jealousy, and repeated promises about leaving Lisa behind. Just days before Lisa died, Seth sent a message that sent a chill through anyone who read it. "Give me 2 more weeks." At the time, no one knew what those 2 weeks were meant for. But after Lisa's death, that sentence took on an entirely different meaning, one that could no longer be ignored. The investigation later confirmed that the round that ended Lisa's life came from a firearm inside the couple's own home. Seth had previously stated that all weapons were safely secured, but one shotgun had never been mentioned. As questioning continued, Seth's timeline kept changing. Statements were revised. Details appeared only after the fact. What had once been described as a home intrusion began to fall apart. Piece by piece, the narrative collapsed until only one unavoidable question remained. If it wasn't an outsider, then who pulled the trigger? The case did not reach an ending quickly. The first trial ended with a hung jury. So did the second. Twice, justice remained suspended in uncertainty. During that time, the name of a neighbor who had already passed away continued to be raised as a possible suspect. His family suffered deeply under the weight of public suspicion. But prosecutors did not let go. They believed the truth had still not been fully spoken. And so, for a third time, Seth Tekel was brought back into the courtroom, where the story would finally face its most complete examination. In 2014, during the third trial, the final pieces were put into place. The messages, the motive, the weapon, the opportunity. This time, the jury needed only a few hours to reach a decision. Guilty, first-degree murder, and the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. Inside the courtroom, Lisa's family broke down in tears, not out of relief or celebration, but because the long nightmare of uncertainty had finally ended. At last, they no longer had to live with unanswered questions. Seth Tekel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with additional penalties. The man who once dreamed of wearing a law enforcement badge will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Lisa and the child she never had the chance to bring into the world will never see daylight, never grow, never live the life that was waiting for them. This case is a bitter reminder that sometimes, the greatest danger does not come from a stranger in the dark, but from the person lying beside you each night. And that a lie, when repeated long enough, can destroy more than one life. Number 7. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. On November 3, 2021, the town of Fairfield, Iowa, settled into its familiar evening calm. As darkness fell, Paul Graber contacted police. His wife, Nohama Graber, a 66-year-old Spanish teacher at Fairfield High School, had not returned from her usual walk through the local park. For those who knew her, this was unthinkable. Nohama was always punctual, always careful, always predictable. But just hours later, deep within the wooded area of the park, officers made a grim discovery. Her body had been concealed beneath a tarp, along with a wheelbarrow and railroad ties. Investigators determined that she had been killed during a violent encounter involving a blunt object. And the people responsible were not strangers hiding in the shadows. Nohama Graber was born in Mexico and spent most of her life teaching Spanish in Iowa. To her, teaching was never just about language, it was about teaching people how to be human. Former students remember her gentle smile, her quiet words of encouragement, and a patience that felt rare and genuine. Each afternoon after school, Nohama would drive to the local park and take a walk. It was her way of unwinding, of reflecting after a long day with students. A peaceful routine. A moment of calm she gave herself every day. No one could have imagined that this familiar habit, something so ordinary and safe, would become the final trap of her life. Willard Miller was a high-achieving student, ambitious, and accustomed to strong academic results. But his grade in Spanish was dragging down his overall average. To Miller, it wasn't just a mark on a report card, it felt like a threat to the future he had carefully imagined for himself. Instead of trying to improve, resentment began to take root. In the immature yet dangerous thinking of a teenager, responsibility was shifted onto the teacher. Blame replaced accountability. And from that growing anger, an unthinkable idea slowly began to form. Willard Miller was a high-achieving student, ambitious, and accustomed to strong academic results. But his grade in Spanish was dragging down his overall average. To Miller, it wasn't just a mark on a report card, it felt like a threat to the future he had carefully imagined for himself. Instead of trying to improve, resentment began to take root. In the immature yet dangerous thinking of a teenager, responsibility was shifted onto the teacher. Blame replaced accountability. And from that growing anger, an unthinkable idea slowly began to form. That afternoon, Nohama Graber went to the park as she always did. She had no idea that two of her own students were already waiting. According to later statements, Miller acted first, with Goodale joining moments later. What followed happened quickly. The 66-year-old teacher had no chance to defend herself. There was no way out. When it was over, the two teenagers moved her deeper into the wooded area and concealed what they had done using the items they had brought with them. When they left the park, they believed they had gotten away with it, but they underestimated the world around them. Classmates of Goodale began speaking to police. Snapchat messages were turned over, messages filled with careless words, indirect admissions, and reckless bragging born from immaturity. Traffic cameras captured Nohama's vehicle being driven by people who were clearly not her. When questioned, Miller's story shifted again and again. He denied responsibility, redirected blame, and pointed to people who didn't exist. But the truth didn't need to shout. It revealed itself quietly, piece by piece, through messages, footage, and facts that aligned no matter how much the story changed. Both teenagers were charged as adults. Before the trial even began, Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale entered guilty pleas. Inside the courtroom, Nohama Graber's family listened as the painful details were laid out, piece by piece. Goodale admitted that he knew exactly what Miller intended to do. Miller, meanwhile, tried to minimize his role, attempting to shift responsibility away from himself. The court did not accept those attempts. The sentences were handed down. Willard Miller received life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Jeremy Goodale was given a lesser sentence, with eligibility for parole after 25 years. For the family of Nohama Graber, no number of years could measure what was taken. A teacher who spent her life guiding young people was lost at the hands of the very students she once tried to help. Nohama Graber devoted her entire life to teaching students how to be kind, honest, and human. She was taken by her own students over a grade. This case left a deep and lasting wound in the Fairfield community. It raised painful questions about academic pressure, about the immaturity of youth, and about how thin the line can be between failure and irreversible wrongdoing. Two teenagers lost their futures. One teacher lost her life, and one classroom will forever be missing the person who once stood at the front, smiling gently, believing in her students, and trusting in the good within them. Number 8. Alexander Jackson. On the morning of June 15, 2021, a quiet residential neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was jolted awake by an emergency call. A young man's voice trembled as he reported that an intruder had broken into his home and opened fire on his family. When police arrived, the scene didn't resemble a robbery or any ordinary break-in. Inside the well-kept house, 3 family members were found in separate rooms: a father, a mother, a younger sister. The only person still alive was 20-year-old Alexander Jackson, who had an injury to his foot. And from that moment on, everything began to drift away from the story he was telling. The Jackson family was seen by neighbors as the kind of household everyone trusted. A successful father, a gentle mother, a younger sister, Sabrina, bright, confident, once standing on a political stage to introduce a presidential candidate. Alexander was an Eagle Scout. He played music. He was polite, well-mannered, with no criminal record and no public trouble. On the surface, they were a model family. But behind those carefully kept walls, pressure was quietly building around the oldest son. His academic performance had declined. His finances were strained. And then came an ultimatum from his father: find a job or leave the house. What looked like stability from the outside was, for Alexander, beginning to feel like a deadline closing in. For Alexander, failure was never just about grades. It meant the collapse of an identity he had spent years trying to protect: the Eagle Scout, the family's pride, the son people expected great things from. As everything began to unravel, Alexander didn't reach out for help. He chose silence. And inside that silence, fear started to grow. Fear of being forced out of the house. Fear of being seen as a disappointment. Fear of facing who he was becoming. A young mind, pushed into a corner, began searching for an escape, one that offered no way back. Alexander told police that a stranger had broken into the house in the early morning hours. He claimed there was a struggle and that he was injured in the process. According to him, the intruder then fled. But the scene didn't support that story. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing inside the house appeared disturbed. A neighbor's doorbell camera showed no one coming or going. From the very beginning, the account began to fracture, first in small details, then in larger ones. And with each question investigators asked, Alexander's explanations grew more uncertain, more tangled. As the version he offered became harder and harder to hold together, the weapon involved was a rifle that belonged to the family. Alexander's fingerprints were found on it. The gun case was discovered under his bed. Experts determined that the shooter had reloaded multiple times in action, requiring familiarity and confidence with firearms. Forensic analysis also showed that Alexander's own injury had been self-inflicted inside his bedroom, not the result of a struggle as he had claimed. The three family members were all shot at close range. One detail in particular made investigators pause: the shot that struck his mother was deliberate and precise. This was not an accident, not a chaotic break-in. It was an intentional act, carefully carried out, leaving behind no room for doubt about what had truly happened. For hours of questioning, Alexander never changed his story. He looked investigators in the eye and repeated the same account again and again about an unseen intruder who had vanished without a trace. But logic was no longer on his side. Every question led to a dead end. Every explanation raised more contradictions. And when all the evidence was laid out together, the truth became unmistakable, clear enough that it didn't require a confession to be understood. Sometimes, the most unsettling thing isn't an elaborate lie, but the desperate grip on a story that has already fallen apart and the refusal to let it go, even when nothing supports it anymore. At the 2023 trial, prosecutors presented a case that left no room for doubt. Motive, means, opportunity. The jury needed only a few hours to deliberate. When they returned, the verdict was read aloud. Guilty. 3 counts of first-degree murder. Alexander Jackson stood motionless as he was taken into custody. Members of his extended family read a statement to the court, saying that the truth was now known. There was no intruder, no shadowy stranger, no story left to hide behind, only the reality that had finally been spoken clearly and without disguise. Number 9. Annette Cahill. In October 1992, in the small town of West Liberty, Iowa, 22-year-old Corey Wickenhauser was found dead inside his own home. He had been attacked with a blunt object, suffering multiple fatal injuries. The scene showed clear signs of extreme violence, yet strangely, there were no fingerprints, no usable DNA, and no witnesses. It was a brutal crime that left almost no physical trace behind. When investigators walked away from the case, they had no idea that it would take 25 years for the truth to resurface, and that the key to reopening it would not come from new technology or new evidence, but from a single memory that had never been spoken aloud. Corey was well loved in that small community. A former high school football player, outgoing and friendly, he worked at his family's bar and had recently become engaged. He was preparing for what looked like a stable, promising future. But beneath that seemingly perfect life was a complicated secret and affair with Annette Hazen, a woman older than him, emotionally intense and deeply conflicted. Their relationship was marked by tension and imbalance. The night before Corey was found dead, the two had a serious argument. So when his body was discovered the next morning, investigators' attention turned immediately toward Annette. Annette cooperated fully with police. She had an alibi. She passed a polygraph test. There was nothing that directly tied her to the scene. After months of investigation with no results, the case slowly faded from attention. Annette left town. She got married, changed her last name to Cahill, had children, found steady work, and lived a quiet, ordinary life as if the past had been sealed away. For investigators, Corey's case became a cold file, shelved and untouched. For Annette, it was a secret that never truly disappeared, only buried deep enough to survive in silence. 25 years later, in 2017, a nurse named Jessica Becker walked into an investigator's office. She spoke about a memory from her childhood, one she had carried since she was 9 years old. During a sleepover at a relative's home connected to Annette, Jessica quietly came downstairs late at night and witnessed something she never forgot. Annette was lighting black candles, crying uncontrollably, whispering apologies to Corey. She said she never meant for it to happen, that it wasn't supposed to go that far. The child she was back then stayed silent, frozen by fear, unsure of what she had seen. But the adult she had become knew she could no longer keep that memory to herself. And with those words, a case that had slept for a quarter of a century began to stir again. Police had no new physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints. What they had was a long-buried memory and a handful of indirect witnesses who said Annette appeared to know details about the weapon before those details were ever made public. With that, they made a decision. Annette Cahill was arrested. A grandmother, a mother, placed in handcuffs for a crime that had occurred before her children were even born. The community was split down the middle. Was this justice finally catching up, or a tragic mistake that could never be undone? At the first trial, the prosecution relied almost entirely on Jessica Becker's testimony. The defense repeatedly challenged the reliability of a childhood memory recalled after 25 years, questioning how accurately such a moment could be remembered. There was no physical evidence, no direct eyewitnesses. The jury struggled to reach a decision. 11 jurors leaned toward acquittal. One believed Annette was guilty. With no unanimous verdict, the trial ended in a deadlock. Once again, the case hovered in uncertainty, caught between doubt and belief, with no clear resolution in sight. At the second trial, prosecutors introduced an additional witness, someone who claimed to have seen Annette destroying clothing that appeared to be stained back then. The witness admitted to having avoided police for years because of personal circumstances, a fact the defense immediately challenged. This time, however, the jury was instructed to continue deliberating until a verdict was reached. Eventually, a decision came. Guilty, second-degree murder. Annette Cahill was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Inside the courtroom, there were no cheers, no sense of triumph. Only a heavy, uncomfortable silence, one that reflected how deeply divided and unsettled everyone remained by a case built not on physical proof, but on memory, time, and belief. Annette Cahill has continued to maintain her innocence. Organizations focused on wrongful convictions stepped in. Requests were made to re-examine the case using modern DNA testing. Public opinion split sharply in two. One side believes justice finally arrived late, but necessary. The other believes a woman was convicted based largely on a fragile memory from childhood. This case does not end with certainty. It ends with questions about memory, about time, and about justice itself. Can a moment recalled from childhood be strong enough to take away an entire lifetime? And if a mistake is made, can it ever truly be undone? In the end, the story of Annette Cahill is not just about guilt or innocence. It is about how truth can fade, bend, or resurface, and how fragile justice can become when it rests on memory alone. Number 10. Todd Mullies. On the morning of November 10, 2018, an emergency call came in from the rural outskirts of Earlville, Iowa. A man's voice sounded urgent but controlled. "My wife was in an accident," he said. "She fell onto a corn rake." When paramedics reached a pickup truck stopped along the roadside, the 39-year-old woman inside had no chance of survival. Her husband, Todd Mullies, told responders it was a tragic farming accident. But within minutes of her arrival at the emergency room, doctors realized something wasn't right. This didn't look like an accident at all. Amy Mullies was a nurse, a mother of 3. Friends remember her as vibrant and warm, someone who could light up a room with her laughter. After marrying Todd Mullies, a large-scale farmer, Amy stepped away from her medical career to focus on raising their children and helping with the farm. From the outside, they appeared to be the picture of success, a prosperous rural family living the life many admired. But behind the barn doors and quiet country roads, Amy lived under constant control, suspicion, and a fear that quietly stretched on for years. What looked stable and comfortable to the world was, for Amy, a life slowly shrinking, one where independence faded and safety was never guaranteed. Amy had once been unfaithful. Todd never truly forgave her. From that point on, his behavior changed. He monitored her movements, questioned where she went, limited who she could see, checked her phone. Amy confided in friends that she felt like a prisoner in her own home. She said she was constantly afraid. And more than once, she made a statement that unsettled those who heard it. "If something ever happens to me, people will know it wasn't an accident." While she was alive, those words sounded like fear speaking anxiety born from a difficult marriage. But when Amy lay on the examination table, those same words took on a far more chilling meaning. They no longer sounded like worry. They sounded like a warning. Todd claimed that Amy had become dizzy after a recent medical procedure and fell onto a corn rake stored in the barn. But doctors immediately noticed inconsistencies. Amy had 6 puncture wounds on her back. The rake in question had only 4 tines. Forensic analysis showed that the injuries came from different angles, some upward, some downward. That pattern could not be explained by a single fall. It could not be explained by an accident at all. The conclusion was unavoidable. Amy had been attacked multiple times. This was not a tragic mishap. It was a killing carefully staged to look like something it was not. Investigators examined the devices inside the home. On Todd's iPad, they uncovered a series of deeply disturbing search queries phrased in ways that pointed toward harm, infidelity, and the physical limits of the human body. Some searches even referenced the emotional rush associated with taking a life. All of them were made just days before Amy died. At the same time, witnesses confirmed something equally important. Amy had been planning to leave Todd. A divorce would have meant the loss of half of a multi-million-dollar farming estate. Piece by piece, a motive came into focus. What had first been presented as a tragic accident now appeared to be something else entirely, a calculated act driven by control, jealousy, and the fear of losing everything. Their son, Tristan, was the one who found his mother. At first, he provided his father with an alibi. But in court, Tristan acknowledged something important. There was a brief window of time when he did not see his father. Just a few minutes. But it was enough. Enough time for Todd to leave the barn area, confront Amy inside the shed, and then return as if nothing had happened. That short gap became the one flaw Todd could never explain away. A small moment, but one that tore a hole straight through his story and could not be repaired. At the 2019 trial, Todd Mullies made a sudden shift. He admitted that Amy's death was not an accident, but claimed he didn't know who was responsible. That late admission changed nothing. The jury needed only a few hours. The verdict was read. Guilty. First-degree murder. Todd Mullies was taken into custody right there in the courtroom. A man who once controlled a vast farming operation lost everything in a single moment: his freedom, his future, and any remaining claim to the life he had built. Todd Mullies was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amy Mullies will never have the chance to watch her children grow up. 3 children were left to face a reality no one should ever have to accept: that their father was responsible for their mother's death. This case closes the series with a stark truth. Sometimes, evil doesn't come from a stranger lurking in the dark. Sometimes, It wears a familiar face sharing the same roof, the same table, the same daily life. And when control, jealousy, and fear of loss are allowed to grow unchecked, a person can turn their own family into the setting of an irreversible tragedy, one that leaves scars no sentence can ever erase.